Hey everyone, so this is week 1 of the Gertie sew along. If you are following along, this is for Butterick 6453, which was designed by Gertie. If you're not following along on the Facebook group, definitely go ahead and check that out. It's so many awesome projects of people who are already jumping ahead, so it's pretty cool to see where this project's going to end up. So if you guys watched my last video, I kind of just talked about the sew along and how Gertie is organizing it, and then what I was going to intend to do with these videos. So I'm essentially following along with the way that Gertie has all her projects lined up, or all her weeks lined up for this sew along. So this past week, not this week, but the past week, she kind of talked about getting everything prepped, getting the muslin prepped, all that good stuff. So that's what I worked on this week. I will say there was definitely a lot of fitting issues, which is something that I'm going to be talking about at length in this video. So I do apologize if this video is long, but I know a lot of people were having concerns about it. So I figured I might as well show it start to finish, literally everything that I did to make this muslin work for me. So yeah, let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing I did was compare my actual measurements against the measurements on the paper. That's something that Gertie recommended, and I always make a muslin of the pattern as is before making any adjustments, just so I can kind of get a gauge. I always know that I'm going to have to do a full bust. I already know that I have to shorten the length, so I always know that that's going to be part of the sewing experience for me, but I always just want to verify how much each of those measurements is going to be. So first things first is shortening all the bodice pieces to fit my short torso, just because even though I've got the big bust, I'm still technically considered a petite by most standards, so I went ahead and just folded up the difference there. It's usually, for me, it's about 3/4 of an inch to an inch, shortening the bodice. And you'll actually see through this entire video that I go through a shit ton of tape. 3M Scotch tape, like the magic tape, that's the stuff I use just because you can draw over it. So in this part here, I am doing my sway back adjustment. Again, another adjustment that I know I have to do every single time I do a video. I'm sorry, every single time I do a muslin. Again, with this particular adjustment, it's pretty easy to do. You're literally just pinching out some of the back length. For me, that's because, again, I have a short torso, so my rear end kind of sticks out a little bit earlier than most people. So my sway back is usually about 1/2 inch to 3/4 of an inch, depending on the pattern. And then Scotch tape, or magic tape, 3M tape everywhere. All right, so this is muslin number 2 after I've made those adjustments. I've taken apart the princess seam so I can see how much more I'm going to need to add for my full bust adjustment. So you're going to need to take 2 measurements. So the first one is going to be the measurement of the full opening, just so you can kind of get a gauge. The next one is from the side front to your bust point, and then your center front to the bust point. And both of those measurements are going to be needed for actually doing the full bust adjustment. You can kind of see how big that adjustment is, and then the back is looking good. The waist is where it needs to be. All right, so first things first, I started with the side front piece, and thankfully the bust point was at the correct spot for me. If your bust point was different, you're gonna have to adjust that part first. So I did my regular lines for doing a full bust adjustment on the side front. And then for the center front, I drew up a straight line from the bottom, about 1.5 inches in. If you check out Gertie's directions that she posted, those ones are pretty straightforward. Then I extended that line to the shoulder, did some snipping all the way up to the shoulder. And then you just want to make sure to cut in from the seam allowance, just to kind of have a little hinge point. And here I am grabbing a scrap piece of paper so I can start tacking everything down. When I'm doing any pattern adjustments, I just make sure to have scrap sheets around, because I will be using them quite a lot. So tape, tape, tape everywhere. There's the hinge, I'm kind of overlapping it there. Now you do have to, and you'll see me rotate this pattern piece momentarily, you do have to create another hinge on the center front just to be able to accommodate adding the additional width to that piece. So again, you snip into that pattern piece, you make another hinge. And then you take your ruler and you spread that pattern piece open. In my case, I believe this particular measurement was about 1.5 inches width. So I put the ruler there, I kind of spread open that pattern piece, make sure that it is as flat as it possibly can be, and start tacking it down. As I said, I go through a lot of tape. So once you've got everything tacked down, as I said, I try and grab any little pieces of scrap paper. So, you know, cut off a chunk of scrap paper wherever you can get a chunk off of there, and make sure to fill in all those empty pieces. In my case, because I did have such a huge full bust adjustment to take care of, there was quite a lot of little bits and pieces of paper everywhere to make it work. All right, so at this point I am going to true off these the bottom edge of the pattern piece. I know that some of the instructions kind of tell you to slide the center front piece down to match that bottom edge. Because I know it's going to be done on fold, and I know that it's a straight edge, like a 90-degree angle, I literally just drew the line down and called it a day. You'll kind of see that as I go through this entire adjustment process, I'm just kind of going quick and dirty. So also at this point you're nearly done with that center front. You do want to make sure to true off the seams, which essentially just means that that seam is going to, or that edge is going to be smooth. So here I am kind of tracing that off, and then I go ahead and grab my regular clear ruler to draw back in my seam allowance. That'll be super helpful if you're having to walk all your pattern pieces, which you should do. I actually have a video that you guys can check out in case you don't know what walking a pattern means. Essentially, long story short, is just making sure that it matches the same size as the pattern piece that is next to it, just so that that seam matches up correctly. You'll definitely want to do that if you're doing this sort of adjustments. Alright, so I'm doing more snipping of my random pattern paper. I don't show it at all in this video, but definitely take the time to flip your pattern piece upside down and tape down that extra paper, because it can be a mess if you don't do that when you're trying to cut out your fabric. Cool, so center front is done, and now we have the side front. Now this is going to work exactly the same way as a regular full bust adjustment would be, like if you had a dart. Now in this case there's no actual dart. That dart fullness is essentially being rotated to the front. So the first thing that I do is draw in my seam allowances, because you will need that to create a hinge in order to be able to do your full bust adjustment correctly. So it's 5/8 as per the Butterick instructions, which is pretty standard. If you have a clear ruler, it makes things like this so much easier. If you don't have a clear ruler, they're pretty cheap. I definitely recommend them. So here I am, snip, snip, snipping that side front piece. Don't mess up like I did, and you're gonna see it here shortly, where I turn my pattern piece and then I accidentally snip right through it. So don't do that. Make sure to leave a hinge. It's not the end of the world if you happen to cut through it, but it's just kind of annoying. So at this point, again, I go back to my 3M magic tape and tape that piece down, and then trying to match up that that edge there. Before I start taping it down though, I do cut into where the dart would be, as if you're working on a regular bodice. Match it up at the top where I accidentally went through that hinge, and then I make sure to separate that distance that was designated when I did my fitting. So essentially the distance that you're doing is that pattern piece to the center bust. Same thing on the other side. So if you're on the center front, you have to measure the distance between your bust point and where the seam line would be, and that is how you can determine how much that pattern piece is supposed to be spread apart. So in this instance, I measured from the seam line to my, bust point, and that's how I knew to spread that piece apart. Because there was such a big gap for me, I think it ended up being about 1.25 inches or 1.5 inches or so that I spread this pattern piece open in order to accommodate my bust. Cool, so here I am trying to true off that seam, but because this is a slightly curved seam, I went ahead and took the French ruler and extended that curve out, extended that front edge straight down. And you can kind of see the hesitation as I'm thinking, I'm like, all right, what's the next piece I gotta do? Which in my case, it was starting to rotate that dart. So under normal bodice, that opening would be a regular dart, which you would close off. But because there is no dart in a princess seam, that dart is essentially rotated forward to accommodate the fullness, right? So here I am chopping off some of the back paper just to be able to rotate this dart. And I'm going to create another hinge at this point. Snip to the center. And because I was worried about breaking that hinge, I just went ahead and forced it there. But you close off that dart and you see how that opens. That will be where the fullness is transferred. So again, tape everything always. I got a little piece of scrap paper that I'm putting under there. Tape that shit down. And I take my French curve and I true off that seam of where that curve is, because you don't really want to do it with the ruler because you're not going to get that curve like you're supposed to. But I will take the ruler momentarily to make sure that I transfer over my seam allowance. We'll make sure to just trim everything down just so it's easier to work with. And you kind of see what the back of that pattern piece looks like. Taped it down, flipped it over, and yeah, this is where I got my plastic ruler to trace off that seam allowance. Now, this is where you kind of have to start transferring markings from one pattern piece to another. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to measure the distance of that opening, because you will need to add that distance to the other pattern piece. And you can see me there making that note. So at this point, before I do that, I also have to transfer that distance there at the bottom of the side front, because again, that will be transferred to the center front bodice piece. So the first part of the measurement that I'm going to be transferring over, I'm just going to go ahead and draw a horizontal line and a second horizontal line for those two measurements that I literally just took. So I'm going to draw those lines, chop open that distance, and spread that measurement apart. So again, scrap piece of paper, tape until the cows come home. Now there I am tracing off that measurement. I think in this case it was 3/4 of an inch, so that's the amount of opening that I'm putting there. and more tape. So this is, you know, essentially why I trace every single pattern piece that I use for any of the sewing that I do, just because I do have to make so many adjustments. And here's my French curve, truing off that edge to make it a curved edge. But yeah, so I trace off every single pattern that I use because the changes I have to make are so dramatic. If I were cutting into every single commercial pattern that I was buying, I would be spending so much more money going back and forth to the fabric store to buy a duplicate pattern. Especially with some of the sewing that I do with vintage patterns, I don't want to be doing that. I don't want to, you know, cut into an original pattern if I can avoid it. and because, yeah, I have so many changes, it is much better for me to do it on scrap pieces of paper or printer pages taped together or bitter taper than doing it on the commercial pattern. So if you haven't checked out that video yet, I'll go ahead and link it in the description so you can kind of see how I trace my patterns. The process is actually, it's pretty straightforward, but I know there's a lot of people who are intimidated by it just because they think it's a lot of work. If anything, it helps me understand how the pattern is constructed. So here I am, almost done. This is the biggest step in the whole muslin making process for me. Oh, and so with the last couple snips, my center, or my front pieces are basically done. All right, cool. So this is what it looks like at this point. It's looking all right. The only problem is it is extremely loose. It is huge on me still. The bust fits great, but I want some of that shaping that you see on Gertie's pattern. I want it to be a little bit more fitted. So I did a little research and, you know, kind of played around with my pattern pieces and figured out how to do that. So I figured out that it is about 1.5 inches that I needed to take out of that center, of those princess seams. So it's 3/4 inch on both the side front and the center front seams. So I went ahead and drew out that line, took my French curve again to make sure that that line is not a harsh line, especially around the bust, and then tapered that down. Here I am drawing back my seam allowance because I will need that to walk my pattern later on. Cool, so once I do that, I mean, I definitely recommend doing these changes first, tracing off your pattern piece, walking the pattern then, and then redrawing your notches if they're in any place that needs to be matched up again. So this is just me riding dirty and doing those changes quickly. Again, here I am taking out 3/4 inch on that princess seam. I'm tapering to the bust point, then taking my French ruler, making sure there's a little bit of a curve there so it's not a harsh line, and then drawing back my seam allowance. Again, 5/8 inch. And then here we go with the scissors, just chopping that distance off of there just to give me a more fitted silhouette on that dress. Cool, so here we go. Final muslin, isn't it beautiful? It fits me really well. The only thing that was not working for me was how you can kind of see my bra at the center back. I'll show you guys how to do that last change, but besides that, it fits great. I actually have the seam allowance along the bottom turned up, but this is actually where it regularly lies. But that's me folding it up to my natural waist. You can kind of see my skirt's actually falling off of me because I've lost some weight. But here I am adding a little bit more height to the center back. So first thing I did was, of course, tape on a piece of scrap paper because I'm going to be adding And I actually added about 5/8 of an inch to the center back, which is essentially the distance of the seam allowance. Figured it was pretty straightforward, and especially after trying on a bunch of bras with the muslin, I knew that I definitely needed at least that much. So I'm extending all the lines. Here I am kind of making sure that that center back is flat, because ultimately they're gonna meet on a flat point, and French curve all the way up to the original pattern piece. And a little bit of chopping action here. Cool. So at this point it is done and it is ready to go. In the end, from start to finish, I ended up with 4 muslins. I have them here. Let's see here. 1, 2, 3, and then I have the one on my dress form. I know it's a little excessive, but to be honest, I prefer to do it this way. I know that Gertie recommended doing it on the tissue paper, but as I said, because I have so many changes to do, I don't even bother doing it with the tissue paper. I literally just make half a bodice until I get it almost right, and then make a full bodice or 2 after that, just to make sure that it's correct. If it's a problem on the bodice, it's going to be a problem on the main fabric. So if you can tell that there's something off, go back to the pattern pieces and even work back from the original. That's again another reason why I don't cut into my patterns and why I trace all of them, because if there's something inherently wrong and I keep coming on the same stumbling block, I'd much rather go back to the original, start from scratch, and see if I can work my way into a better position. So with that said, I'll also, if you guys haven't checked it out, and I will link it in the description below, if you are worried about walking patterns and making sure that they fit, especially after you do so many pattern changes. In my case, because I did so many huge full bust adjustment changes, I had to make sure that that front pattern piece fit the back pattern piece. I know a lot of people don't know how to do it, and I know Gertie mentioned it, so I went ahead and just did like a really quick tutorial just to kind of explain the concept. So if you are a beginner and you're making this pattern, it makes sense when things don't fit, and you know kind of how to approach them to make them fit. So with that said, I think the next project, or part of the project that Gertie did, was actually sewing the real fabric in the top. I believe as of today the straps post just went up. I'm gonna be catching up and kind of talking about that next in my next video, so I'll show you guys how the bodice looks at that point, including the facings, so you guys will have a little bit more of a gauge as to where I am in my project. But anyway, I hope you guys like this video. Thumbs up, subscribe, all the places, all the stuff. I really appreciate it, and definitely I will see you in the next one. Bye guys.